Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabali Kid. Hello, Shaka.
I am hugely terrific, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
Well, it's good that, of course, we link up again this Tuesday.
A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us live here in Washington. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself and ask some questions. Today we are going to have a lively discussion, and maybe let's start in China. Shaka, this is not the first time that all African leaders are headed to Beijing for their, maybe I should call it annual summit, what has become like an annual summit of sorts, to go and pay homage to the Chinese president, who, by the way, made good on his promise, $60 billion in addition to what China is already doing in Africa. Your thoughts?
Does that, by the way, include also the king, the absolute monarch of Swaziland? Because the last time I checked, he seems to be doing business with Taiwan.
Incredible. That was fascinating in a sense that he's the only, almost the only person who didn't show up for that Beijing conference.
Very interesting. Of course, China is doing a lot of things in Africa. You and I have seen some of these things, as a matter of fact. We saw some of these things on hand in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We saw some of these things in the Republic of Zambia. You remember the Dr. Kenneth Kaunda International Airport. It's under enormous renovation and expansion, and you name it. We saw some of these things in Zimbabwe. We also, I also saw some of these things manifested in Malawi. So there is no question when you look at the fact that you also had a privilege of being a beneficiary of Chinese, marvelous engineering in Kenya when you rode, this marvelous train from Mombasa to Nairobi, and you told me it was an incredible piece of technology. It was obviously technologically on the cutting edge. It was very comfortable and what have you. But earlier today, there was someone else who apparently also passed through that particular experience from Mombasa to Nairobi, and you can't believe what he was saying. It was almost the reverse of what you were sharing with us. What's happening? This guy says the train, in fact, is not comfortable. And it's not as fast as you think it is. In fact, it almost takes the same time from Nairobi, from Mombasa to Nairobi, almost takes the same time with the truck. Truck takes 7 hours.
No, that's not true.
Truck 7 hours, and that this one takes 6 hours.
No, that's not true. That's not true. Maybe they have a very different version of their own facts.
Are you talking about alternative facts?
I think so.
Do those exist?
Yeah, because at least I can attest to the fact that I rode on that train 2 times. And at no time, unless if they had an accident maybe on the road, at no time
no, he said
did
that,
it take 7 hours from Mombasa to Nairobi.
No, he said 6 hours. And part of the problem, he says, probably is they stop on 6 different stations.
Okay, so there he's correct. If everything happens on time, it takes about 5.5 hours from Mombasa to Nairobi. That's the train that goes through the counties. That makes different stops. But if you take the express train, it's under 5 hours.
He also says that a lot of Kenyans really are mad about that, by the way, because Kenyans, in fact, don't seem to really have ownership of the project, because most of the jobs are in fact done by Chinese.
True, they have a point there, but the facts are, first of all, this was a huge infrastructure development. Kenya borrowed almost $3.8 billion to boot.
And how is it going to pay for it?
Well, it's a long-term process. Shaka, maybe I can make an argument here. I think all countries borrow. There is no country that can grow without borrowing. Even businesses, a simple business, you can't grow if you can't borrow money.
You are right, but you do not borrow recklessly, because in fact there is an article, there's an argument that actually Africa is in huge trouble. especially because of the manner in which it has actually borrowed money from China.
You have a point there, but again, I want to go back to this same argument. The United States of America borrows money from China. Right now, United States borrows more money than any other continent or any other country combined from China.
The issue is not about borrowings. The issue is whether, in fact, you are borrowing simply because you are living beyond your capacity.
That's not true. I mean, I think as African countries' economies continue to grow, they are going to need all this infrastructure development. That's one of the reasons they are borrowing money. A lot of, yes, true, some countries will incur debt that they can't pay off over a long term. It will take years, for example, for a country like Kenya that even has a great economy to pay off some of those debts. But eventually, long-term goals, these infrastructure projects create employment for the local people. For example, the Kenyan...
If in fact they create employment.
Absolutely,
also,
absolutely. There's no question about it.
If in fact you put that money to good use, not everywhere that seems to be the case. In fact, in some countries, some of the money that is being borrowed is reflected in Kajansi type of houses, which are personal, belonging to very powerful individuals, not to the community.
Again, now, that's the weakness of the institutions themselves, the countries themselves. They haven't come up with a framework.
The leadership.
Yes, a framework to fight this corruption. Obviously, if you had a multi-billion-dollar corporation like the Kenya Railways Corporation, you have access to unlimited funding or access to resources, you can do whatever you want. But the question here, maybe let me pose this question to Shaka. Why is it that a lot of people talk about China's investment in Africa, looking at it in the context of colonialism? Is that how you see it?
Oh, I think there are reasons sometimes to actually, look at it that way, because let's face it, no country comes to the help of another country simply because of what they call altruism. No. It's about a country's vital national security interests. China is not in Africa because it's just a good guy, because it loves Africa. Africa is not a beautiful woman. China is there precisely because it can benefit from that interaction. And it is benefiting. The question is now, what about the African leaders, and I will probably call most of them rulers? Are they aware of the fact that they too have their own vital national security interests? So that, in fact, when you have China, in addition to Turkey, to Brazil, to India, and probably to the Western, system as we have known it, it means, frankly, that if you're an African leader, especially, you have an opportunity because you have options. You can take advantage of these options for the benefit of your own people. But you see, you can only do that if you are a leader like the Madiba, Nelson Mandela, the late South African president, who once said, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It's what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life that we lead.
That's a great quote, Shaka, but I could also tie that to what is happening. Again, going back to borrowing money in China. So we talk about how our leaders have failed to develop the infrastructure. We talk about how our leaders have failed to give people social like amenities, like hospitals and roads and whatever. And China
service delivery.
Yes,
but the first infrastructure,
China is doing that wrong.
The first infrastructure that need to be developed, as a matter of fact, is human. It is the mind. It is not roads, not railways, not airports. It's human. You have to make sure that your people feel that they actually have ownership of these projects, that this ownership belongs to them, and therefore they are in the best position to defend them. because they need them.
But Shaka, again, there is no shortage of human capital on the continent. For the first time ever, we have more educated young people on the continent. You like to use the word intellectual balance of power has been shifting in our favor. You have a lot of young educated people.
Educated on paper. What have you been able to do with that? Balance of power shifting in our favor.
Yes, what they don't have is that infrastructure that they can use.
Most of those people, by the way, the last time I checked, are unemployed.
But when you have infrastructure developments like this coming into the country, there's going to be employment created.
Yeah, but you need skill sets that are in a situation where they can benefit from whatever kind of physical infrastructure that you put in place. I mean, we're looking at Kenya, for example. They have that great train, yes, but who is actually driving that train? It's not the Kenyans, even though they were trained.
True. Actually, that's not correct. They are still training. It takes about 5 years to train a train driver.
Come on, man.
You have a lot of young people who are doing apprentices or internships to be potential train drivers. You have a lot of people. It has created over 40,000 jobs.
It's very interesting that you actually helped walk me back in memory lane to when I was a very, very much younger guy. We had, for example, the Uganda Air Force. We had the police air wing. And guess who were actually piloting the police air wing helicopters? They were Europeans. And what was the argument? That Africans cannot fly a helicopter. I was in Burundi at one time, and Burundi had engineers, lawyers, doctors, and what have you. But my friend, they had an army that was called a Tutsi mono-ethnic army. And the reason is very simple. When I asked them why did they have diversity, because they invited me to the officers' mess, there was not a single Hutu. There was not a single, you can't believe this. There was not a single Muganwa. The elite, there was just Tutsi in the officers' mess. When I asked her, I said, can you produce for me 1, 2, 3, at least non-Tutsi? They just looked at me and laughed. I said, why don't you have army officers from these communities? And I was told, sincerely, without a shame, that these guys could not pass the aptitude in order to join the military academy. But these guys could actually be engineers, they could be doctors, they could be lawyers, but they could not be army officers.
Interesting. Let's go to our social media comments. Let's start with Rith Tang. African leaders must stop looking for money somewhere else. There is more money right here in Africa. After all, this money is going to end up in the pockets of individuals. Your thoughts?
I think what Africa, I think I somewhat agree with what he's saying, because let's face it, Africa, nobody can ever tell you sincerely, even if you are blind, that Africa is poor. Africa, on the contrary, is very rich in terms of resources. But unfortunately, Africans are poor, probably the poorest on this planet Earth. Why? Because of the leadership deficit. Because you have rulers, sincerely, who have not been able to figure out a way of managing the economy, managing Africa's wealth, and making sure that whatever theory they come up with developing, it is for the benefit of the daughters and sons, uncles and aunts of the African continent. And so they go on actually begging around the world. But guess what? Whoever, they say that whoever pays pays the piper
calls the tune.
Calls the tune.
Well, let's segue. For that, maybe we can segue to a different topic. Let's go to Uganda now. But before we do that, let me remind our audience that you are watching Shaka Extra Time here at the Voice of America, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. And for those following us, we are reading your comments right now. Let's go back now to Uganda. Let's talk about the Bobi Wine factor. Bobi Wine, it's been a couple weeks now. He's still making headlines in Uganda. For the first time, he talked to the audience while here in a U.S. hospital. He communicated back to his people, talking about how, telling his side of the story. I'm sure you've had an opportunity to look through what he said. Your thoughts?
You know, I have to be very honest with you, Paul, that when I read that articulate, remarkably articulate communication from Bobby Wine. Mind you, I have not been able to, to kind of like verify, to cross-check and verify whether or not, in fact, that was authentically a letter or a communication from Bobby Wine, even though I have been told reliably by some people who are very closest to him that that was indeed him. But as an independent journalist, what I need to do is to be able to verify that that is indeed from Bobby Wine. If in fact it is, and even if half of it is true, I hate to tell you this, Paul. I used to be in the Ugandan army. I was a paratrooper, among other things. Are
you a deserter? You deserted?
Well, whatever you may want to call it, at least I was able to separate from them and ended up, here under the political tall grass, and eventually worked my way to the extent and to the point that I have the opportunity, for example, to be able to sit with you here and breathe the same air and interact globally with the people who are interested in listening to some of the things that we actually do. It was not a particularly good experience under Idi Amin. And I was told that under Obote too, it was equally not a particularly good experience. I cannot talk about that because I never actually had an opportunity to live under Obote II type of experience. I was in the United States, going through universities and what have you. But given what I have been told, including, of course, you being one of those people who lived under Obote II, when I compare these two regimes or juntas or whatever, Idi Amin and Obote, and then look at the Yoweri Museveni regime, I hate to tell you this. If even half of what Bobby Wine he has alleged in that particular communication document, then I have to tell you that I agree with some who will say that the current government really is like the Idi Amin government and Obote II rolled into one.
But Shaka, are you surprised by those allegations? If they were true, you've seen what they have done to the other opposition leaders. For example, he's a refugee, the way they manhandled him and beat him up all the time.
To be very honest with you, I have to say that I agree with a guy called, for example, Alex Haley, the author of the best-selling book, Roots, and also an author, by the way, of the autobiography of a great man, Malcolm X, who once said, find something good in someone and praise it. So you can't say, for example, that for the last 32 years, Museveni has been in power. He has not done some good things. He has done some good things. But I think that when you actually put him on balance right now, he's increasingly looking like someone who probably has done very few good things. In fact, if I were him, to tell you the truth, I would figure out a way of exiting State House, passing on the baton to the younger generation, really, because his future is behind him. Anything that he has ever done good and whatever is probably behind him, to the extent that if he now continues to do some of these things that we are seeing in newspapers, in media and what have you, there are very few people who will even remember those few good things.
But there is a school of thought there that argues that President Museveni has done a remarkable job. He has brought stability in the country. He has grown the economy.
What do you mean by stability? You mean what they call Baganda,
people are able to sleep and go get on with their business, except for the recent months where they've had insecurities. But a lot of people credit President Yoweri Museveni for doing that. And he's hugely popular when you go to the rural areas. Isn't that...
Which particular rural area?
All over the country. That's why he's been...
Can you prove it?
I don't have any evidence to prove that, but I'm saying what...
Have you ever seen him in any rural area working there independently without many security people, without bulletproof, vehicles and all that kind of stuff? I mean, if you are liked by your people, sincerely, then why do you have to protect yourself against them? They are not enemies. The last time I checked, these are your people. So you have to understand that the state, and I mean any state, is very powerful. It controls very, very important institutions, including the institutions of propaganda, including the institutions of the media. And so they can portray a very good image, a good picture. They can say whatever they want, especially because in the context of Uganda, sincerely, which is democratically challenged, his voice, or the voice of Ugandan authorities, is the last word.
How about, maybe let me go to a comment from Mohammed Ahmed Mansour. How do you feel about the disorderly conduct of the Ugandan police and the Ugandan military towards opposition members in Uganda?
You know, I am not surprised because as Dr. Munini Mulera has ably written a very interesting article in today's Daily Monitor about defending Bobi Wine and some other artist who is a very, very staunch supporter. Some might call him, in fact, sycophant of Ugandan incumbent President Yoweri Museveni. This is a guy who is on record saying that his friend, his colleague, artist, Bobi Wine, probably does not really have those types of wounds that he claims to have, that he is faking it. I don't know whether he's a doctor, whether he's a nurse, but that's what he has said for the record, and he has really run into a lot of problems. I don't doubt for a second that Museveni is probably a good man. And Museveni has done good things to a lot of people. There's no question about it. But then there is also another issue of Museveni. As a matter of fact, a university schoolmate of Yoweri Museveni at what was called the University College Dar es Salaam, which was part of then the University of East Africa, called Generali Urimwengu, who happens to be a lawyer to boot, and also an acquaintance of mine in the sense that whenever I actually go to Dar es Salaam, I find some time to link up with him so that we can exchange some social amenities. He wrote a very interesting article in the East African, and he said, if you look at the Yoweri Museveni of 1986, the revolutionary Yoweri Museveni, with the Yoweri Museveni beginning with like 2001 up to today, that these two individuals would actually have to fight. Because in his view, the revolutionary Museveni died long time ago. These are his words, not mine. And what we are dealing right with now is like a reactionary type of Yoweri Museveni. And there's a lot of evidence to put.
Shaka, you talked about, you rightly quoted the famous Alex Haley saying that you look for something good about somebody and praise it. What's the one thing you can praise about President Yoweri Museveni? What has he done? Because there are a lot of people who think he's a good guy, even though we see, on the contrary, his security guys doing other things. It could be that these security guys are errant, they are wrong guys, security guys doing certain things. Could that be possible?
Well, I think that you have to give him credit, for example, for having the confidence, having the guts, for example, to reject the dictatorship of his predecessors. He rejected that dictatorship and was able to gather the courage and the will to fight that particular dictatorship. The only problem I have with him is that having actually fought and defeated them, it was simply like winning a battle. He did not win the war, because he could only win the war, for example, if he had become different. Unfortunately, when you look at the evidence, I am not a lawyer. I never went to law school. So I am eminently probably underqualified to convict President Yoweri Museveni because I'm not a judge. But if you look at the evidence that is available and that even people, in fact, who happen to be blind could actually see it, if you took that evidence in the court of law, he probably would be convicted of being a dictator.
Interesting. Let's go to other comments here. What do you make of the slogan "People Power"? What does that mean, especially for Bobby Wine fans, people who want you to talk about people power? What does that mean?
He's not actually inventing anything here. He's right on the money. Because even dictators, including Yoweri Museveni, will actually tell you that power belongs to the people. And that's exactly what Bobby Wine is telling you, because that is supposed to be the reality. The fact of the matter is, when some of these people talk about people power, they talk about people power because they want to, in a sense, do a sort of public relations and what have you. And I'm talking about a man like Yoweri Museveni and other comparable, African rulers like him. And we can talk about Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guinea. We can talk about Paul Biya in Cameroon. We can talk about Paul Kagame in Rwanda. We can talk about Omar Bashir in Sudan. We can talk about Salva Kiir, South Sudan. There are so many people we can actually talk about on that continent. What we need is not those people. What Africa needs is like an Abiy Ahmed, the most recent Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who seems sincerely to reflect what I would call the qualities and the values of a new breed of African leadership.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow?
Tomorrow, in fact, it is interesting. We are talking about a program which was started by President Barack Obama, YALI, which is named that, in fact, appropriately called the Washington Fellowship, basically, Mandela Washington Fellowship. We're talking about a President Obama who, I was with him in Accra on the ground in 2000, I believe 2009, and he addressed the entire continent and talked about how Africa does not need strong men like Yoweri Museveni. What it needs are strong institutions. And because he failed probably to make a difference when it comes to interacting with them and disciplining them and what have you, despite his powerful position, he decided to see very far. And hence, he introduced this program, this yearly program, to train, to expose young African leaders for future responsibilities.
Very briefly, has YALI succeeded, in your view?
We don't know so far. I think the jury is still out, but frankly, I think it is likely not to fail.
Why is that?
Well, because you are being exposed. You are getting opportunities to see how the world works. And you are educated, and eventually you will get an opportunity to be placed in a certain specific position, and you will be able to call shots in a manner, at least that is environmentally friendly, environmentally, socially friendly. We do not need people who tell you they are fighting to restore democracy. And in fact, what they restore is more of the same. Because democracy, the last time I checked.
Shaka, unfortunately, we have to end our discussion here. It's been a lively discussion. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.
And I think you're